All right. So this week we are talking about how our social influences, historical influences, and economic influences impact family policy, social policies, a lot of educational policy, and thus impact our lives. So with social and personal views, these do impact family policy. So it's looking at how context matters. So looking at the fact that context is everything as it comes to influencing policies and thus influencing our lives. So to fully understand U.S. family policy requires understanding in how it is shaped by prevailing cultural views, our free market economy, longstanding traditions of limited public involvement in private family matters. But for other countries, there's different histories. So you'll notice when we start with making motherhood work, Germany's history, particularly World War II, following World War II, and that we had East Germany and West Germany. And so that history of the two countries that are now again one country. And so they have that social historical influence as well as their economic influence at play. And so society's values influence our lives and our policies impact what is considered right and wrong ways to live. And throughout this, and sort of where this history piece comes to play sometimes, is what were the understandings of family life pre-20th century and now in the 21st century? How do these connect with each other or don't connect with each other? And so we see these various historical periods, religions, communities have family structures and how those influence us even today. So they're not static entities. Families haven't been static entities, as we discussed in week 2, but fluid and changing structures that are shaped by cultural, economic, political, and social contexts in which they operate and are within. So families influence society and society influences families. So when we study a variety of different countries, their histories, their cultural values, this can show us a variety of options regarding policies, especially family policies. And that's what you'll do largely with making motherhood work. And nothing happens in a vacuum. This context is everything. It really impacts us. What is wanted is confined by policies and dominant societal views and beliefs, from anything of gender to family to career, our economy, etc. So our laws and our policies can signal what is value within a society or a workplace. And thus even things like our All right, I think you just had a blip because the internet did something funny. But even our work family policies can contain assumptions about the places in society for people based on gender identities and social locations. So one big context piece at play around the world are individualistic and collectivistic continuums. So these are different continuums. They're not one long continuum. They're two different ones. And communities, countries land on these in slightly different places. Even within the United States, you have some regions that are a little bit more, they're higher on the collectivistic and lower on the individualistic, and vice versa. So we do see variation even within the United States. And these do influence the policies that each nation has in place, from anything from education to parental leave, etc. With collectivism, this emphasizes cohesiveness among individuals and prioritizing the group over the self, basing social behavior on the needs and identity of the group, family, or community. So communalism. And it's the worldview where collective goals take precedence over individual goals, and interdependence within the group is emphasized. And so it's advocating the importance of our responsibilities to the groups, families, and communities of which we are members. And it's looking at and believing that democracy cannot be sustained without a citizenry willing to respect the rights of others and assume responsibility for the collective good, even which such actions require personal sacrifice. So that can be time, that can be money. We think about taxes as a quote sacrifice for the greater good. It's going towards roads. It's going towards an educated citizenry. And then within it's spending more money on these things because it's seen as part of the public good. And we see this out of a lot of our Nordic countries, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Netherlands, Denmark, as well as a lot of Asian countries, so China, Taiwan, Vietnam, etc. And then with individualism, this is very much focused on the independence, personal responsibility. It's promoting independent ideas, finding private solutions for life's challenges. The famous idiom that's been around for a century or more is pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So the idea of meritocracy. It's, as Colin says in your book, Making Motherhood Work, the principle of personal responsibility is central. This individualistic idea is central to U.S. society, and it underlies our country's social policies. So it's the idea of no government support of families and no requirement of industry or employers to support families either. So if you have a family, as well as for yourself, it is your job and yours alone to support it. And so having children is a choice. It is not a guaranteed right to have support from the community within the individualistic idea. It also looks at education as being a private good. It's privatized. It's based on how good the neighborhood you're able to afford is. It's based on how much can you pay for college. And so it's that independence and self-reliance that's ingrained within our society to the point of being devoid of family and community connections, and oftentimes then to the point of loneliness. So there was a famous book about 20 years ago called Bowling Alone. And so that book is very much talking about that we're doing things on our own. We're not building a collective to make change, even for things like keeping our own land against the pipelines that are trying to do sort of steal land from people to do these massive oil pipelines. And so with the U.S. having the penchant for individualism, it's also coupled with skepticism about the role of government, making it difficult to create a society that cooperates and works together for the well-being of individuals and families. So there's not a social safety net at place through the government, but rather assumes that families are the fail-safe, assumes that you have the bank of mom and dad to turn to. And so when these safety nets are smaller and less certain, families serve more prominent roles as educators, as healthcare givers, personnel managers, social workers for their own members. And so when we're looking at the continuums of collectivism and individualism, it's sort of having the question of, is it up to the government to assist with social norms, social expectations, education, raising children, et cetera? Or is it up to the individual? And same with public health. Is it up to being around socially connected, or is it about what's right for you and you alone? And so the United States very much around COVID has decided it's up to you. It's the personal responsibility to be vaccinated or not to be vaccinated, to mask or not mask. Where a lot of other countries that are higher on the collectivism, even some of the states within the United States that are higher on collectivism, higher rates of vaccination, more masking, especially the Asian countries that have had earlier pandemics in the start of the 21st century, where masking is part of the norm because it is taking care of each other as much as for themselves. So we do see this in our day-to-day life really now at this point. So continuing to think about the private good or the public good, it's looking at and questioning whether there's private value of the functions that families provide for members and how members benefit from policies and programs they engage in. And so policymakers who are more interested in public value of the functions of families that perform for larger society look at the bigger picture to see what public benefits of families have on society. And so we can look at the private or public value question, particularly through education and through marriage. So we're having a variety of conversations around education the last few years, including preschool, pre-K, and higher education. So when we're sort of trying to play this game of is it a private good or is it a public good, are we going to invest money towards these pieces, towards having children educated and then adults educated as citizens? Whose responsibility is it? Is it everybody's responsibility, or is it the individual and individual family's responsibility? So with preschool, it is privately funded. There's very few regions or states that have public funded pre-K. And so it's very much private. It's individual families. Can they afford it? Where can they afford? How many hours a day or week can they afford? And how do they get the children to preschool? And so there's all these navigation pieces versus having it within the public school system, having an extra year or 2 years built into the sort of K-12, but having pre-K to 12 available. We also have it of looking at higher education. And in the last 20 years or so, it has been moved away from being seen as a public good and back to being a private good. And so historically, it was a private good. Only the landed gentry went to college. And then land grants, so SDSU was a land grant, that was meant to shift, that was meant to change. It was meant to be accessible to everybody, well, men particularly, but over time, everybody. And then the economy started shifting, our ideas started shifting, the demographics of higher education started shifting, and states started pulling back, started saying, well, you have other ways of making money. You can raise your tuition dollars. So that's what universities had to do. They raised their tuition dollars. So it moved from states sponsoring higher education to you sponsoring your own higher education, your own college education. And so we have the high student loan debt crisis that we've been talking about. Even the most recent conversation of student loan debt. Does the government relieve some of that debt, or is it up to the individuals to pay off the debt? Of course, ignoring a lot of the structural challenges and ways in which the policies were not allowing people to get rid of or pay off their student loan debt. So we have that shift. We're still navigating that, still having these conversations. Where do our values lie? And then with marriage, again, we've had a shift of is it a public good or is it a private good over time? Historically, if we think of the royals in particular, and I gave some examples in week 2 of economically wealthy families intermarrying to maintain that wealth, but also royals intermarried, particularly the Germans and the English intermarried to maintain power, but also to maintain stability for the countries. And so there was an element of public good to that. Now we view marriage as a private good. It's about us being happy. What can we get out of this relationship? Are we getting enough out of this relationship? Is a lot of the conversations around marriage. And so it's looking at the individualism of self-expression and personal growth versus what is good for children or the community or extended family, where the public good would be, is it stable? Is that family stable for raising children, et cetera? And so we are starting to more and more have that private good, the high value of marital commitment and individual self-expression, the rugged individualism of going off and taking care of oneself being only in that in the neo-local. So it's just about you, your spouse, and the children you have, not about parents or grandparents, and some of those ideas that are coming to play, especially in the last 30, 40 years or so. Until the 1960-ish, people in the US had less of that individualistic perspective of marriage, and then in the 1960s and beyond started to prize expressive individualism. So it's that self-discovery related to relationships, psychological growth, a belief in individual specialness. And that can be a very positive shift in the individualistic idea in thinking about the private good. We can have a lot of sort of that self-expression, identities. We have more opportunity to express ourselves versus falling into line based on what our parents want, based on what our community wants, our hometown, our religious organizations, et cetera. Eric Kleinberg is a sociologist, and he has said that not long ago, someone who was dissatisfied with their spouse and wanted a divorce had to justify their decision. They had to prove that there was abuse. They had to prove that there was cheating. But today, it's more of the opposite. If you're not fulfilled in your marriage, you have the right to leave. But if you then stay and you're not fulfilled, you have to justify it in a different way, where you used to have to justify your divorce prior to no-fault divorces. And so we're having this tremendous pressure, cultural pressure to be good to ourselves, to oneself. But we also have the cultural pressure to be married, to find that fulfillment through marriage. In the content page on D2L, there's also Andrew Sherlin video talking a little bit more about marriage and individualism and the private and public good. So now we're shifting into economic contexts. And as we dig in, you will notice how gender norms in particular are influenced by the economic policy types and how these behave. And different countries, different quote, welfare states, institutional and political contexts reinforce norms of masculine and feminine behavior. So Dr. Collins talks about liberal welfare states, conservative welfare states. For states, it's capital S, so it's referring more to countries, not lowercase s, referring to things like South Dakota versus North Dakota versus Minnesota. And so these do not map onto U.S. political parties. So where we might use liberal related to the Democratic political party, conservative related to the Republican conservative party, the welfare state conversation, the economic conversation does not map onto our political parties. So just remember that. We're having a different conversation than political parties. The U.S. is considered a liberal welfare state. It is characterized by limited government intervention. It's market capitalism. So it's free trade. And when governments do provide direct welfare assistance to citizens, the resources are focused on those in greatest need. And so those who meet certain criteria with great limitations and obstacles to access through cumbersome rules for those who do want it or need it. And the rest of the population's needs are left to be resolved by the market or from within their families. Within the liberal welfare state, we also oftentimes talk about being neoliberal. And neoliberalism, again, not an identity or a political entity, but it's a sort of critical perspective of the economy, of our free market. And it comes largely out of philosophy and economics, and psychology and sociology. And it does build from a lot of, the conversation around neoliberalism builds from Marxist scholars. And it is a description of global political economies. Again, it is market-oriented, it's eliminating oversight and regulation, lowering trade barriers, it's a laissez-faire economic policy perspective for extensive economic policies such as privatization, fiscal austerity, deregulation, free trade, and reductions in government spending in order to enhance the role of the private sector in the economy. So letting money govern rather than government govern. Taxes and regulation are minimized, public services are considered should be privatized. The Libertarian political party very much promotes that idea. And it sees citizens as consumers whose democratic choices, lower D democratic, not the party, are best exercised by buying and selling a process that rewards merit and punishes inefficiency. And so this is why things like boycotts are so beneficial. Conscientious consumerism is influential. So how we spend our money on which companies impacts policies, decisions, etc. This perspective, the neoliberal perspective, views inequality as virtuous. It's a reward for utility, a generator of wealth, which then is the idea it trickles down to others to enrich everyone. And so it's the idea that the market will ensure that everyone gets what they deserve and that the market will correct all inequalities, challenges, and crises without additional assistance, where capitalism, corporations, companies will be self-correcting. If we get rid of neoliberalism, if we see a world without neoliberalism, this would mean less individualism, more social services, more government role in the economy, less competition, and fewer market-based approaches in social relations. And so again, a lot of times where we talk about neoliberalism, even within family science, it's around education. And so it's putting things back on the consumer. It views you as students as the consumer. And so where universities will do anything they can to maintain you as a consumer, maintain that you're still paying tuition dollars either immediately or through student loans over and over again versus having support outside of your tuition dollars, outside of your own paying for things. And then conservative welfare states provide citizens with some government resources. Oftentimes these are attempting to maintain traditional roles and family forms. It provides things for divisions of labor. So Germany in particular is considered a conservative welfare state. A little bit more talking about economics and family policy and looking at how family policies and economics are linked. The family well-being and the economy are very linked through things like taxes, labor, and workforce as society ages in particular. And where some family policies put into place to help develop the next generation of workers, so our education pieces, et cetera. And to also assist with the current labor force. So you've noticed a lot of policies coming out in the last couple of years to try and maintain a labor force, trying to get people to, quote, go back to work, ignoring some of the health challenges, long COVID challenges, the high rates of death, et cetera. So a lot of policies based on our capitalistic, individualistic perspectives. And these drive a lot of the financial decisions of the country. So it's that private, market-driven, decentralized system. And again, the type of education one receives is vastly different depending on the school you attend, what neighborhood you were raised in, what state you were raised in, et cetera. And with little, and so the free market, again, has little to no government oversight. Most recently, with up pricing, which you may have heard of, we had very high gas prices this past summer. And so part of this was the oil companies saying, well, everybody's paying for gas again, so we can raise the prices and people will pay it. And because the government didn't have the right in some ways to oversee this or chose not to oversee this, the oil companies were setting these prices, the gas station companies were setting these prices, and they were getting very high until the government stepped in and said, wait, this is not okay. This is hurting people. They can't afford it. They can't work if they have to pay these high gas prices. So we need to start reducing it. And they did it through a variety of things, including releasing extra oil, extra gas that was in reserve. So we have these things at play with free market capitalism, of the few oversights regarding goods and services, regarding prices, and so relying somewhat on supply and demand, but also the companies, it's reliant on the companies. So it does focus on individual rights, limited government, private ownership, important, and reliant on supply and demand to keep costs low. Another economic policy system that you will encounter, particularly making motherhood work, is social democracy. And this is political and economic democracy, having economic and social interventions to promote social justice within a democratic political structure. Again, little d democratic and capitalist-oriented mixed economy. The government and market work together to provide benefits for more people, where there might be income redistribution, regulation of the economy, social welfare provisions, so having a social safety net. It is characterized by high taxation and expansive government-provided resources, where countries support equalizing access to benefits with resources provided to all citizens, regardless of income or personal circumstances. So this is our universal healthcare conversation, our universal pre-K conversation, higher education being free to citizens, having a base income. So Switzerland is one country that has a base income as part of their social democracy, as part of their social safety net. You'll read of a few of the countries having payments towards childcare, towards raising children. So additional supports through the government that way. So with the economics and family policy, in a lot of ways in the United States and Italy to some extent and a few other countries, families are expected to perform a lot of functions for quote free, where they're doing the caregiving of the young and the old. And if families are doing this, the government doesn't have to pay for it. Again, it's up to the individual, to the private pieces. And it's being committed to the members of your close circle, your family members. And when it is outside the family, it's very low-paying jobs. So childcare is very low-paying. Nursing homes are very low-paying. Oftentimes, it's people who are immigrants, people who have been marginalized throughout history in the United States. So underpaid labor when it's related to family life, related to childgiving, childcare, caregiving, et cetera. So we see this unpaid entities because it's based on the market. And where do we put our money? Are we putting our money towards engineers, building roads, or are we putting our money towards our people, towards each other? And so it's showing where our value is by where we're putting our money. And so in the US, there is very low wage labor for much care. Nursing homes often require personal financing. They're very expensive, for example. But in other countries where people do live at home, there's fewer options for the outside of home care. And there's privatization of family functions, where the care industry is very much underpaid. There's family commitment and strong market economies where things like marriage are seen as an economic act. And we have really seen this being reinforced through our policies in the last 25 years. So in 1996, we had the Defense of Marriage Act saying that marriage was between a man and a woman. This was in response to Hawaii starting to legalize same-sex marriage. And then about 6 years later, under the Bush era, the there were policies put in place where you got even greater tax breaks, tax benefits if you were married. And so that very much was trying to reinforce the importance of heterosexual marriage. And then as same-sex marriage became more and more fought for, that was a large argument, was you're further marginalizing, oppressing same-sex couples by not allowing them to get married to get the same tax breaks as heterosexual couples. And so there's that economic piece. Part of the reason the Bush administration really supported the tax breaks for marriage was to maintain marriage, was to maintain stable families. It didn't fully work that way, but that was the goal. And so it's looking at who can marry, how does our economy influence some of this, who does it financially benefit to marry or harm. For a lot of people who are on who get disability supports from the government, if they get married, sometimes the income bracket goes above what the government will pay, and so lose their benefits, lose their disability benefits and supports. And so there are some of the policies that then say, well, you can't get married because then you lose the supports that you need, even though you still are not financially stable enough to do it yourself. The educational attainment and when people get married or don't get married or start kids, having kids or not having kids. A lot of the whether to have children conversation in a lot of Western countries right now is highly based on the economy, based on can I afford this? Is this the right decision economically? The wedding itself is an economic act as well. And so we also look at this through the work-family tensions, work-family conflict, where we're taught that work is the most important thing in our life. We're also taught that family is the most important thing in our life. So we have this constant tension. Am I taking enough time for my children, for my spouse, for my siblings, for my parents? And is that taking away from work, and vice versa? And so really in the last year or so, as we're having this labor movement conversation, we're seeing people be like, well, work might not be the most important thing. They don't value me. So I'm going to put more of my eggs in the family basket. And so we have seen some of that shift, some of that sort of tension come to play of family and economics. We've also seen it in the last couple of years of a lot of women leaving the workforce because they cannot work from home and do all the childcare as daycares close, as schools close, and reopen and have COVID outbreaks, et cetera. And so we're reliant on the unpaid labor of females in particular. And so we've had a large drop of women in the workforce because of that. Will it come back? We're still waiting to see. So we do see these shifts. And so these expectations, are there supports? Are there not supports? Where does family life, social connections come to play within all of this? And within the United States and other free market countries, we expect nonprofits to fill in gaps. And so these nonprofits, yes, can include religious organizations, general nonprofits, et cetera. And it looks at how they're funded, et cetera. And so nonprofits are tax exempt, and none of the profits will benefit an individual. It's meant to support the mission of the organization. Charities or organizations with philanthropic goals aim to improve the quality of life for individuals and communities, and they must operate for the benefit of the public. And then mutual aid is a grassroots way of filling the gaps. It's when a community comes together to meet people's immediate material needs, especially in times of financial hardship, if there's not enough support from the social services within a region, the government, et cetera. So it's trying to assist sort of the gaps between where government ends and family support also ends. So it's filling that gap as much as possible. It's resource sharing, it's money, it's groceries, it's rides, providing people who may not receive or be eligible for due to barriers, services. And it's helping each other help themselves. It removes power structures. There's no hierarchy within mutual aid as part of where it's that grassroots element. It emphasizes that horizontal network with mutual flow going back and forth, not just top down or bottom up. And so there is no overhead with mutual aid or other places that funds go. There's not a staff the way there is for a nonprofit charity. So it all goes directly to those who need it and working together. It's all through volunteer leaders, volunteer connections. So it does focus on collectivity and relationality of communities. So we do see that. Minneapolis has a lot of mutual aid sort of groups at play that have been very active in the last couple of years related to Black Lives Matter, related to COVID, related to the LGBTQ plus community. And so we do see mutual aid in a variety of different ways. And so that's one way that we see collectivism within our individualistic society as well. So at this point, I am going to pause and you will see the rest of what you should be working on this week in the D2L content page.